You're listening to Psych with Mike, and the most important way to support the show is to find us on YouTube and hit that subscribe button. So no matter how you listen to Psych with Mike, find us on YouTube, smash the subscribe button, and we really appreciate it. Now, here's Psych with Mike. Welcome to the Psych with Mike Library. This is Dr. Michael Mahan.
And I am Brett Newcomb.
And this is a fine November morning. How are you?
Fine. How do you do? Yes, I'm doing as well as it can be expected.
Yeah. So we, as we've been telling people, have been doing this book thing and trying to get this together. You actually are much more further along in the process than I am, but we just finished.
There's nothing new about that.
Yeah, nothing new. But we just finished chapter 4, which was a chapter talking about the differences in the adolescent brain from either the childhood brain or the adult brain. And this is like something that is obviously totally in my wheelhouse. But you have been focusing more on the clinical aspects of the things that we have been discussing. And you said some really interesting things about adolescence that I think is very salient that I'm not sure that people are aware of, specifically that the idea of adolescence as a developmental stage has really only been around for about 100 years.
Well, it has only been around for 100, 125 years. It correlates pretty closely to the Industrial Revolution. When families lived on farms, they used to have as large a family as they could make because they needed the labor on the farm to produce the food and generate enough income for the family to survive. When we started moving away from farms and into the cities and looking for jobs, then the factory owners wanted little children because they could work in small, tight spaces. And so we went to a phase where we had child labor, and kids would work 10, 12 hours in horrific conditions every day, 6 days a week, and their parents would get their money and support the family. Gradually, society learned that it needed a somewhat educated group of workers, so they began to focus on the development of the American high school system. What does an educated person need to have as a basic foundation so that employers all over the country can feel free to employ them? Can they do basic math? Can they read? Things like that. So then we developed the high school system in part for body storage. Round all these kids up that were adolescents, because when you go through adolescence, as you're going to want to talk about, you have all these emotional and intellectual changes that fluctuate in channels. It's not a consistent across the line improvement or maturation. So you put them in small enough groups that an adult in the room can supervise their behavior, so you keep them off the streets and out of trouble. And in the meantime, you try to teach them basic knowledge and skills. High schools even had like home ec and industrial arts programs to teach kids mechanics and carpentry and cooking and sewing and what have you. So it was a diversion from what we'd done for centuries, which in primitive tribes, when you reach puberty and can contribute to the population of the tribe, then they want you to be more responsible. You have to be able to support what you contribute. So they have, when they go through puberty, they have what are called rites, R-I-T-E-S, of passage. And they're tested. The boys are tested as warriors and herdsmen. They're separated from the girls. They're separated from their moms. They're finally taken away from their moms and handed to the warrior dads for supervision and training. And if they pass the rite of passage test, then they're physically marked. Their teeth are filed, they're tattooed, something that says to anybody walking by, that's an adult. And therefore they're responsible. If they offend me, I can deal with them. If they're a child, then I have to say, well, it's a kid, they don't know, they haven't learned, that this village doesn't teach them very well, but they're just kids. So women would do the same thing. They would go and have their rites of passage, and if they passed it, they were marked, and then they were eligible for marriage and motherhood and contribution as they may. Today we have what are called rites of passage, but it's R-I-G-H-T-S. It's my right. It's my right to drive a car. It's my right to own a gun. It's my right to vote. It's my right to enlist in the military. I have rights, but they're not all administered at one fell swoop. It's not like you turn 18 and everything comes to you as adult status. You get one at 15, one at 14, one at 18, one at 21. You can get married. All those things apply. So society has had to adjust to that fluctuation, and so we developed what is called adolescence as a period of life, which most people think runs from 13 to 20. And that's what I talked about and wrote about.
Yeah. And so these, the rites of passage, RITES, that happened before the Industrial Revolution, those were like ceremonies, though. It was a rite.
Well, they were actually tests followed by ceremony,
Yeah.
If you passed, like graduation.
Right. And so now these rites of passage are when we attribute onto an individual the maturity to be able to handle this new responsibility. And so we give you these new, more sophisticated responsibilities that you go out and use as a responsible person, hopefully.
Levels of access and power that come with autonomy. Like you can get a pilot's license and fly a plane, or a driver's license to drive a car, or a beautician's license and open your own beauty shop. But you have to go through the training program and pass the test and be certified. Right.
And so one of the things then that I am always really, really interested in and focused on is the biology. And the biology of being an adolescent was always a part of this, but we just weren't aware of it. We weren't aware of how the human brain was developing. We just assumed that people thought all the same way. We didn't have the ability to understand how that can be impacted. And so the two places where I really focus on when we're talking about adolescence is the, coming online of the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is where executive functions are. So the ability to delay gratification of needs, the ability to pay attention for longer periods of time, the ability to anticipate consequences. We would expect people as adults to be able to do those things.
Yes, and because they weren't, then we developed a whole lot of categories with labels for illnesses. There must be something wrong with them. It must be broken. So this child is oppositional defiant disorder. This child is on the spectrum with different learning disabilities. This child is a criminal and a crook. So one of the first steps is always to step back and point and say there's something wrong with you.
Right. And one of the most, so the way that this, the prefrontal cortex is maturated is through myelination, which is a fatty substance that grows on axons. And I know that your eyes glaze over when I start talking about that stuff. We don't have to really parse that out. But what we do have to understand is that that is a maturational process. And when that process is delayed, one of the ways in which we experience that most commonly in our society is called ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is oftentimes associated with this maturational process of that frontal cortex. And so all of those things that you talked about can also have some impact or some implication in that maturational process. But before we have a fully maturated frontal cortex, we don't have good ability to delay gratification. We don't have impulse control. We don't have those things. Those are called executive functions. And what we know is now that the brain isn't actually completely maturated until middle age.
But that's again, compensatory strategies, which we talk about with ADD, ADHD. Society has compensatory strategies, and our compensation for that reality was to insist that structure and discipline would overcome it. And so if the parents provided adequate structure and discipline for the child would behave and do what it was supposed to do. If the schools provided adequate structure and discipline, then the child would behave and do what it was supposed to do as it became an adult and acquired the abilities to be an adult. And it worked for many, many people. It doesn't work for all people.
Right. Right. And especially it doesn't work for those individuals that don't have that structure. We worked in schools for a
Right.
lot of our careers,
Yeah.
and we live in St. Louis. I would go down into the St. Louis city schools and work with kids who sometimes very legitimately didn't know where they were going after school because they didn't have a permanent place of residence. And so they wouldn't get that structure at home, and then they would go to the school, and the school would try and impose that structure, and it would oftentimes be very difficult or even a catastrophe because the kids just didn't know how to change, how to adapt into that structured environment. And so what's really important is, for me, is that consistency. You really need, for that to work, this idea of we're going to impose structure and that's going to teach the child how to behave. That really needs to be a very consistent thing for that to work well.
Well, and that's why for many, many years, kids that weren't working out in the school system and who also then got in trouble with the law, the judges would say to them, okay, you can go to reform school or you can join the Army. And if you join the military, then we'll write off these issues with reform school and give you a clean bill of health. And then in the military, there's the right way, the wrong way, and the Army way. So you learn to do what you were told, the way that you are told. And if you're 17, 18, 19 and you join the military, you have developed more of the myelination than you would have at 13, 14, 15, where you're rocking the system and they can't figure out what to do with you. So when we had that kind of an Army, that was also then an alternative that seemed to work for our society. But when we got rid of the draft and went to an all-volunteer Army, what we now have is 3 to 5% of the population go in the military, and we can identify the geographical and economic areas from whence they come, and the rest of them don't. And so then now what do we do with those kids 16, 17, 18 who developmentally are not progressing to maturity and ownership of themselves as an adult in the way that society wants? Because you've got two different issues. One is, what do you need to make you happy, make your life work? The other is, what do you need to keep society from crushing you?
And I've never asked you this. I'll be interested to hear what your answer to this is. But if we set aside the idea of going into a theater of war, so we say, okay, we're because I think that's a very different thing. Do you believe that there can be positive benefits for individuals who are struggling to fit into society going
I
into the
absolutely
military?
do. For the individual and for society.
Yeah,
I've
agree.
always favored universal service.
Yeah.
2-year option of universal service for boys and girls in our culture to give some standardization of acculturation, but also to give some discipline and some income so that they can begin transitioning out of their childhood home and into the adult world. Even if they then go back home after their 2 years of service or wherever they go, they will be better equipped to do that. And I think society would reap benefits also. I mean, like the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, during the Great Depression, Franklin Roosevelt created it, and they created roads, they built buildings, they made nature trails, they cleaned up spaces. Was very useful for a lot of people, and it gave them regular income. It gave them consistent uniforms to wear, so that we weren't fighting over who's wearing a Kansas City jersey versus who's wearing a New York jersey, versus who's wearing a Beyonce outfit. We don't have those struggles if we all have to wear a uniform.
Right. And so that was an example of an organization that would impose structure on the adolescent, but wasn't actually the same as military service. We don't really have any
and
of
it wasn't
those.
all just adolescents for the CCC. Grown-ups were also.
Sure, you could join at any point in time. Right. But it gave a place for people who were in that position as an adolescent to go, and we don't really have anything like that run by the government anymore. Yeah. So would you be in favor of something like that developing again?
Yes.
Yeah. I think I would be too. I think we would have to think about what we wanted that to look like. But yeah, the idea of service to the society and also being able to have a place where you could go and feel wanted and feel like a part of a team, some camaraderie, and have some structure imposed, I think that would be a great thing for us to have as a nation.
Yeah. I think we're missing it.
Yeah. So then the other part that I talk about in the biological aspect is that we have areas in our brain that control our emotions. One of the very specific areas is called the amygdala that some people may have heard of. And during adolescence, these areas of the brain are actually increasing in volume exponentially, where other areas of the brain are actually decreasing. So these emotional areas of the brain are in ascendance. They're really, really maturating very quickly. They tend to overwhelm then the connections to the prefrontal cortex that provides that kind of executive function. And that's why adolescents generally have these big emotions. You're never going to feel things more intensely than you will as an adolescent.
Well, that's interesting to me because my perception is that, and I taught high school for 20 years, and then I counseled adolescents for another 30-something years. So I've been through this field many times. But what conversations I very commonly had with adolescents, because they would get all upset that they didn't get their rights and they should be able to do what they wanted to do, and they weren't making decisions. And very honestly, for the most part, until you become somewhat independent, you aren't making the decisions in your life. Your parents are, the school is, the judge is, somebody else is telling you, you have a curfew, you have to be home at this time, you can't smoke, get off the phone, eat this for dinner, what have you. And they would all bitch and moan about it. And I'm like, yeah, you are in the back seat of the car of your life and somebody else is driving it. If you want to drive, get in the front seat. But if you want to drive, that comes with consequences, and you have to be prepared to pay for the price of your choices.
Right.
So if you choose to study and get good grades in school, whether school makes any sense or not, if you can demonstrate competency of adaptation to the demands of the school, the expectations, then you will get more privileges. If you don't demonstrate that competencies, you will get less privilege. Your life will get tighter and harder, and you'll be out somewhere looking for a job. So you get a job. If you can't accommodate the demands of the owner of the business and perform in the way that they expect, then they won't hire you, they won't pay you, and you won't make any money. So if you want to drive the bus, get in the driver's seat, but it comes at a cost. And the cost is grown-ups pay the prices.
Right. And I think that I think we have a real struggle with that in our society right now. Would you agree? Because this is what I see is that so the very, very leftist liberal opinion would be people should be able to be in charge of their own destiny regardless of their age. So kids and at very young ages should be able to make...
counseling too. Speak your truth. That's bullshit.
Yeah.
You got to survive within the functions and requirements of the system. And once you've met the basics, then you can extrapolate outside of that and beyond that in your own way, and that's okay.
The place where I see this being an issue is that, we say, okay, you should be able to be in charge of your own destiny. Okay, that's fine. But then these people who tend to be on the most liberal side of this argument also then say, but you shouldn't have to face the consequences. And I think that's unrealistic. And I think that that's what we're saying is that you can't
worked.
Right. You can't have freedom without having responsibility.
Exactly.
There's just no, and if we go back and eventually we are going to talk about Viktor Frankl, but when we talk about the existentialists, their basic premise is there is no freedom without responsibility. The two can't exist separately.
And they can't. Yeah. And life demonstrates that. I remember conversations with my youngest son. I mean, he went to college, he got a good job, he's making good money, and we'd go out to dinner. He never reached for the check because in his entire life he never had to. Nobody expected him to. He had the free ride, sit down, order what you want, order within this price range, whatever our limits were that we put on him, have what you choose. And then we would go out to dinner or something, and I'd be like, "Son, pick up the check," And he'd like, "What?" And he wasn't upset about doing it. Right. It just never occurred to him.
It just never occurred to him to do it.
And so over a year or two,
and it wasn't that he didn't have the money.
Oh, he had the money, but it took a year or two. Yeah. Now he pretty regularly says, "Here's my card. I'll pay for that, or let me get that." Or he's learned from watching me. hand the waitress the credit card and then say, Dad, I got it. Now, it's not because I'm cheap and don't want to pay for him. I want him to be responsible and to behave and live responsibly within the world that he's creating.
Right. So adolescence is an actual stage of development. We know that now. It is distinctly different than childhood or adulthood. There's a lot that goes into that, both biologically and sociologically. And so it's something that we will continue to talk about. If people have questions about that, please let us know. Send those to us, psychwithmike.com. The music that appears in Psych with Mike is written and performed by Mr. Benjamin DeClue. And as always, if it's Friday, it's Psych with Mike and Brett.